I would like to start my speech in 3 to 1. It's such a shame that the proposition believes that the solution towards unequal access to education is to normalize STEP for young people from the very beginning of adulthood. Because the biggest problem in Indonesia is not simply that students cannot enter a university, the deeper problem is that higher education has become increasingly more expensive while economic opportunities remain unstable and unequal. Now, this is the context of the world proposition and opposition must concede. On both sides of the house, students struggle financially. Middle income families and lower society would be pressured heavily, and scholarship would still remain limited. But as opposition, we believe that solution should never be creating a system where vulnerable students carry a financial burden before they even achieve financial freedom era. Now, there are three important things to note under this setup. Firstly, let us characterize what vulnerable students actually look like in Indonesia. They usually came from lower to middle income family who can survive daily life but cannot financially are not financially secure enough to constantly afford for university tuitions. Higher education is still financially very stressful are certain for them. Secondly, this is a fundamentally state responsibility motion. Now, meaning we are debating whether government should help students directly or make students carry the financial burden themselves. Now, our path of victory here is proving that student loans only delay financial suffering instead of solving structural inequality. Now, under their world, students borrow money first and then repay later once they start working. Even if repayment is delayed, the debt still exists psychologically, economically, and etc. What do we mean by psychologically here? The student would be bothered by thinking about how to repay constantly and would be bothered even before they graduate. Now, they would become very scared of failing. They would be scared of, they won't be unemployed. They would be scared to disappoint their family if they can't pay their debt off. This is important because young people would begin their adulthood with debts or financial pressure. Now, let us clarify our world here. Nation does not believe access to education should remain unequal. Instead, we believe governments should prioritize better public university funding, more targeted scholarships, and etc. Most importantly, we believe that the burden of fixing educational inequality should primarily fall on the state, not vulnerable students. Now, what is the urgency of this case? You might ask. The urgency here is that it's extremely important because Indonesia already faces youth unemployment and unstable wages for fresh graduates. Now, this is the problem. It's likely to worsen because university degrees now no longer guarantees stable, high, and paying jobs. Now, for example, many graduates today become online drivers, temporary workers, freelancers, despite they are holding a university degree. And as a result, many students in propositions world may graduate yet with debt while struggling economically. Firstly, today I want to talk about two substantive arguments now. Firstly, why does the student loan mechanism create long-term financial vulnerability? Secondly, why this policy is principally justified because it's normalized debt as the price of education. Now, before moving to my substantive arguments, let me respond directly towards the proposition's frame. Firstly, proposition tries to characterize students' loans as harmless because repayment only begins after employment. But this actually ignores the reality that stable employment itself is not guaranteed in Indonesia. Many graduates still struggle with low salary, temporary jobs, and more unemployment. Wait, repayment still creates long-term financial uncertainty. Secondly, proposition heavily relies on comparison towards other countries like Singapore. But Indonesia simply does not have the same economic stability, graduate salaries, or institutional capability. Now, their capitalism only works in countries with much more stronger systems. Deeply, proposition believes that loans are better simply because scholarships are limited. But limited scholarships do not justify normalizing debts. Now, the solution should be expanding state support, not transferring the burden and the risks towards the vulnerable students. Now, lastly, saying is essentially debt is better than no education. Panels, this situation should not justify harmful systems. Temporary access means nothing if students remain financially trapped afterwards. Moving on then to my first substantive argument on why student loan mechanism create long-term financial vulnerability. The thesis of my argument here is that students merely postpone financial suffering instead of eliminating it. Firstly, student loans create long-term psychological and economic pressure. This happens because students know they will eventually carry debt regardless their future uncertainty. For example, many students may feel pressured to immediately pursue available job instead of developing their actual interest or their actual skills. Students will become more focused on survival rather than growth because the repayment pressure shapes their career choices. This is harmful because education should create upward mobility, not new forms of financial anxiety. Secondly, propositions assumes that graduates will easily repay loans once employed, but this is very unrealistic. Indonesia's markets remains highly competitive and unstable, especially for those fresh graduates. For example, many students work outside their degree field, receive low starting salaries, or work temporary contract jobs. Even if proposition says repayments are income contingent, students still carry debt accumulation over long periods of time. It will continuously affect the people far into adulthood through prolonged economic stress. Now, thirdly, the student loans here fail to solve structural educational inequality. Wealthier students here will know their families still can support them if something goes wrong. Poor students do not have that safety net to guarantee. This means vulnerable students may still avoid university because they fear future debt burdens. Therefore, proposition does not truly equalize educational opportunity. Now, moving on to my second substantive argument on why this policy is principally unjustified. The thrust of my argument here is that education should be treated as public investment, not a financial gamble imposed onto vulnerable youth. Firstly, proposition normalizes debt as a standard, a part of adulthood. This is dangerous because young people are taught educational opportunity must come together with financial burden. Education should empower students, not immediately tie them to repayment obligations. Firstly, the state the primary obligation to expand educational access. The proposition, the government shift parts of this responsibility towards students themselves. We believe governments should strengthen public investment directly instead of creating a repayment dependency. Lastly, this means propositions will still disproportionately burdens vulnerable communities. Under Before I close this last speech, under proposition, students gain temporary educational access but carry a long-term financial uncertainty. But under opposition, we push government to solve educational inequality through stronger systematic public investment instead of individual debt dependency. Now, even if proposition manages to increase university enrollment numbers comparatively, they also created a generation of financially pressured graduates. Now, because entering the university alone is not enough, if afterwards students remain economically trapped, we care not only about access but sustainable quality of life after graduation. Therefore, I strongly, proudly, very to oppose. Thank you.